1-3, this is Victor 7-3, over. This is Victor 1-3. This is Victor 7-3, Roger, arrived red, negative sit rep, nothing going on out here, permission to terminate over. And this is Victor 1-3, Roger, over.
Peace is an ideal we have deduced from the fact that there's been intervals between wars. 100 miles down that road, 2.5 centuries ago, French and German troops were fighting against Austrians and Dutch and British at a battlefield called Blenheim. 1.5 centuries ago, about 2 hours' drive over that way, German and Russian and Swedish troops were fighting against Frenchmen at a battlefield near Leipzig. 2 generations ago, French and Americans and British and Italians and Canadians and Russians and Australians were fighting against Germans and Austrians and Hungarians and Turks in trenches that extended almost all the way around the horizon. About the time I was learning to walk, American B-17s and British Lancasters were flying over this spot on their way to bomb Dresden. And at the end of that war, they drew this border down through the middle of Germany. It's the odds-on favorite place for where the next World War will start. Here in Europe, the forces of East and West directly face each other, and it's the only place where they do. When they met here in 1945, they were allies. The mood is different now, and the preparations are not for peace.
When you've got soldiers who are busy, who are doing the things that they're going to have to do when the war starts, because the initial things that my troopers will be doing is scouting. And as soon as the major formations are detected, then we will kill them.
Looking east, American NATO soldiers see the frontline troops of communist tyranny. Looking west, Warsaw Pact border guards see the Western forces of reaction and imperialism. They all think that they are in a unique confrontation. NATO and the Warsaw Pact are the particular labels this time around, but these are only the latest in a long series of opposing alliances, part of a system which has given us, on average, a major war every 50 years for the past 3 centuries. Amid the jubilation at the end of the Second World War, the last thing on anyone's mind was that war might ever happen again. No one talked of the war to end all wars, as they had in 1918, but the idea was the same. People believed that things would be different this time. The winners would remain united and ensure a peaceful future. When the wartime leaders arrived at Potsdam in 1945, they thought that their wartime collaboration would continue. But the habitual suspicion of great powers about each other's intentions quickly destroyed their alliance. The smiles soon dissolved, and the victors of the last war were pulled apart by fear. And so, every day now, the Cobra helicopters of the 11th U.S. Armored Cavalry patrol the inter-German border. The alliances of East and West maintain a constant alert here, searching for signs that the Third World War is underway. So far, they've been lucky enough not to find what they've been looking for. On this border, where nothing of real importance has happened in 4 decades, small events take on a large significance.
If we step across the border, and they've had people do this in the past, you know, not realizing it, but 9 times out of 10, when we're up there, you know, we carry cameras. So they carry cameras. And if we just, you just step your foot across that border and they get your picture, then that is coming down. And then, you know, it takes a why was this done type of deal. And somebody better have a good answer, because we're just not supposed to do that. That's part of our everyday briefing. We're not supposed to waive nothing. We're there, they're there. They can do what they so desire. We do what we're told to do. That's the way it works.
We have a dual mission, really, one of surveilling the east-west German border on a day-to-day basis, 365 days a year. And while doing that, preparing for war, preparing to defend in case that the Warsaw Pact would decide to move to the west.
Я могу еще раз повторить, что мы ни на кого не собираемся нападать.
I can repeat once more that we don't intend to attack anybody. But if we are attacked by an aggressor, we can and will inflict a devastating retaliatory strike to destroy any aggressor. I think that should be known at any level.
Within a few hundred miles on either side of this line lie no less than half the world's total stock of conventional armed forces. That's enough to wipe Europe off the map, and maybe trigger the destruction of the rest of the world, too. Over there, stacked up all the way back to the western military districts of the Soviet Union, there are about 3 million soldiers and 20,000 tanks and combat aircraft. Facing them here in Western Europe are at least 2 million soldiers and over 10,000 tanks and aircraft. If you count in the reserves drawn from NATO and Warsaw Pact countries that extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean in both directions, you're talking about at least 10 million soldiers. It's been nearly 40 years now since really big forces like that fought each other, but the last big war was by far the worst we've ever had. The Second World War killed 40 million people, and it reduced most of the cities on this continent to rubble without the help of nuclear weapons. Another total war like that, but this time with nuclear weapons, would be at least 10 times worse. So since nobody in his right mind wants to fight a total war with nuclear weapons, we've invented this new category of warfare, conventional war. That is, war using almost everything except nuclear weapons. Any future war between the great powers will probably begin, at least, as a conventional war. And this is where they would fight it. And their preparations for the day the curtain goes up help to convince each side of the other's aggressive intentions. Colonel John Sherman Crow, NATO frontline commander, has definite views on how the Soviets will play out their part.
Highly motorized, armored, very volatile, chaotic, ruthless, mechanized attack with tanks, armored infantry carriers, chemical weapons, tremendous amounts of artillery, indirect fire, and certainly a significant amount of air on his part.
Like a bad war movie from the 1950s, the Warsaw Pact's own film of its maneuvers manages almost to parody Colonel Crow's view. The Soviets are not 10 feet tall, but in conventional forces they do have more of everything, all based on a philosophy of make it simple, make it work, and make more of it. The bulk of these forces are designed and trained to carry out a lightning attack into Western Europe. The Soviets intend to be sure that no matter how a war starts, it will be fought on somebody else's territory, not theirs. So if war comes, they would send wave after wave of men and machines into West Germany in a relentless high-speed drive.
It doesn't necessarily mean that they intend to do this, but what NATO cannot ignore is that they are capable of doing it.
I believe that the Soviet Union and its allies, Soviet Union, has not the intention of it attacking Europe with the elder leadership which has known the last war, but they have the capability. And intentions can very quickly change. You may remember a certain prime minister coming back from a conference waving a slip of paper, peace in our century, peace in our time. Well, that was about 10 months before the last World War. So and so we must take into account capabilities.
Taking capabilities into account means NATO plans concentrate on stopping the kind of attack the Soviets could make. The West Germans, just like the Soviets, do not want to see a war fought in their homeland. So to keep them happy, NATO has devised a strategy called forward defense.
My mission is to defend central region of Allied Command Europe as far forward as possible. That means immediately at the inner German border or the German-Czech border. And we will do that immediately there.
The trouble with forward defense is that it doesn't make military sense. The normal way of dealing with a massive tank attack is to set up a very deep defended zone to give the defender a chance to wear down and eventually stop the attacking tanks. That would hardly suit the West Germans. Almost half their country would be overrun before a Soviet attack could be stopped. So for political reasons, NATO plans to make its defense along a line very close to the frontier. There are two things wrong with this. One is that it probably wouldn't work because the defended zone would be too shallow. The other is that to the Soviets, forward defense doesn't look like defense at all.
The idea of this forward defense is to deploy NATO forces as close as possible to the Soviet frontier so that, in the case of necessity, they could act on our territory. This concept, this doctrine, this strategy, whatever it's called, is defensive in name only.
The people in the Kremlin are not stupid, and they're quite logical in their thinking on these matters. We say that we have no plans to defend forward of that line, in other words, to invade East Germany. And I believe I can say with perfect confidence that there are no such plans. They'd be dynamite. We have no such plans. Very well, the Russian planners would say, but what provision have you made for defending in depth the other way? And when they look at this, they say, how are we to believe your assertions that you've made no preparations to take the only other alternative, which is defense by forward action, DDR, when you've made no preparation for defense in depth? And what's wanted is a counter-penetration force in depth in the North German plain, which can fight the classic battle in depth when forward defense breaks down, which all linear defense, unless you've got overwhelming superiority in forces along the line, must do.
If NATO's thin forward defense does collapse before a Soviet attack, the Western alliance has only one answer: to use its battlefield nuclear weapons, even at the risk of starting the escalation to all-out nuclear war. As for the Soviets, well, this is a Warsaw Pact production, but it's almost worthy of an epic from Cecil B. DeMille. All these tanks are the reason the Soviets are less likely to use nuclear weapons first. They have superior strength in conventional weapons. They've planned it this way, and it's their history that's made them do it.
If you want to know why the Russians now own almost half the tanks in the world, give a thought to what happened here. Leningrad is Russia's second city, and during the Second World War, it was besieged for 900 days. Hardly a building was left standing, and 600,000 Leningraders died. The Russians are determined not to let that happen again. They're being silly, of course. What threatens this city nowadays is nuclear weapons, and all the tanks in the world can't stop them from reaching here. But like most people, the Russians are trapped by their past. The whole military balance in Europe is frozen history. The Soviets have all those tanks in Central Europe because back in the early post-war days, that was the only counter-threat they could offer to the West's overwhelming superiority in nuclear weapons. But since the Soviets now have nuclear weapons too, along with their tanks, the West has hedged its bets by building up its conventional forces in Europe as well. It's no wonder that each side is deeply suspicious of the other.
So the Soviets also have nuclear missiles scattered among their conventional weapons in Europe. That doesn't stop the old game from going on as before, at least in the soldiers' heads. There's a military doublethink that pretends the nuclear weapons aren't there and that conventional war is safe. The trouble is, we no longer really know how a conventional war might work out either, because we haven't fought a big one in a very long time.
Because wars don't go on all the time, whereas technological change does, every new war now starts with a lot of untried technology around. So it's perfectly understandable that our predictions about the next war are often wrong. Back in 1914, people thought that the war would be a few big decisive battles and over in time for the troops to be home for Christmas. But it didn't work out like that. In 1939, people thought it would be like the First World War all over again. Trenches, attrition, stalemate. But it wasn't. And we too think that we know what a conventional war in Europe would be like today. Basically like the Second World War, except at an even faster pace, and maybe with a few new weapons like nerve gas thrown in. The generals are well aware, in private, that our assumptions about the shape of a European conventional war are a house of cards. It's a quite elaborate house, but the cards which make it up are no more than a series of educated guesses about how the technology would work out in practice. Because nobody really knows what would happen when all of these weapons are used in large numbers, in combination with each other, in real battle.
Withrow by the center! Quick march!
In the absence of real battle, the only way of trying to calculate how things might work out is to hold exercises. And that's what both sides do every autumn. The generals want to believe that they can fight a conventional war successfully. Nuclear weapons would, after all, mean the skills they've spent a lifetime developing are irrelevant. At the opening ceremonies of the NATO exercises, a little saber rattling precedes the serious business of playing at conventional war.
It's indeed an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this inauguration of Autumn Forge 1980. Taking place from northern Norway to the other flank in Turkey, confirming our ability and our willingness to repel aggression wherever it might occur in Allied Command Europe.
Paratroops of the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division arrived direct from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to take part in these elaborate and expensive war games. They join up with soldiers from Britain, Germany, and half a dozen other NATO countries, and for a couple of weeks they pretend they're fighting a real war.
Tango 0, Tango 1, you are to take up a counter-penetration position on the west. I say again, the west of the small bag position. Over. Tango 1, Tango 2, Tango 3, move now out.
They split into attacking and defending sides, They're given objectives to gain and positions to defend, and then they fight it out.
Was that Bravo Echo Charlie?
Bravo Echo Uniform Charlie.
Bravo Echo
Uniform.
Charlie. Uniform Alpha, I thought it was.
Yeah, well, it might be.
Take your order. Man up, can you get on?
Nobody dies, except by accident. It's war with the consequences neatly removed. The experience of Colonel Roderick Jones of the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars is fairly typical. He's been a professional soldier for 22 years, and although he's seen minor actions in distant parts of the world, he's never been in a full-scale war. Neither have any of the 550 men and 47 tanks he has under his command. The tanks are not the tanks of World War II, and one of the things that makes them different is their price tag. A modern tank costs $3 million. Colonel Roderick Jones's entire salary for about 100 years.
Tango 3, this is Tango 9. Is that one of your call signs over by that red barn ever? Roger. Roger, right.
For your $3 million, you get a machine that can keep moving on today's lethal battlefield and fire accurately on the move over a distance of about 2 miles. What this means for Roderick Jones and his men is that their battlefield will be a pretty empty place. They will fight inside machines against other men inside machines. Most of the killing will be distant and impersonal, a long way from the days of hand-to-hand combat. There was a time when human endurance dictated the length of a battle. Fighting stopped when the soldiers were too exhausted to carry on. Now, if the machinery can keep going, the men are expected to keep pace. With electronic night fighting equipment, men would remain in action almost continuously for as much as 6 days. There's even been talk of keeping them awake for 80 hours at a stretch with amphetamines. The plans are unreal, but they're matched by the surreal incidents of the maneuvers. The tank ahead has been killed by Corporal Coffey of the Orange Force, acting as stand-ins for the Warsaw Pact. There are rules to this game, and the rules say that once dead, a tank should move out of the way of its attacker and let him continue his advance. That's what Corporal Coffey has in mind. But tank number 72, manned by Americans, has other ideas. So as in all good games, when the opposing sides disagree, the umpire gets to arbitrate.
What we're going to do, let this troop straight on, okay? The Orange Force is going to continue its advance. Right now.
Right down these trails.
Right down this trail.
You're killing me.
Well, I don't mind. I'm an umpire.
Start it up.
Can you, any chance you might be able to move that? Otherwise, I think you might end up tin.
At the end of the day on exercise, win or lose, you walk away to see another dawn. But that doesn't mean these men are unaware of what lies ahead for them if they ever get into a real battle. At the points where the Soviets might concentrate their tanks to break through, the scale and pace of the destruction would be almost unimaginable. And those points are pretty obvious to anyone who can read a map.
According to a very senior American general, this valley is the site of the biggest tank battle in the history of the world. It's a battle that has not been fought, but this area, the Hünfeld approach to the Fulda Gap, lies on the shortest route between the East German border and the Rhine. If the Russian tanks ever do roll west, the terrain will funnel them into this valley, and this is where NATO will make its stand. In military parlance, this valley is a killing zone.
If the Soviets did attack, several thousand tanks would come through this gap. The local odds would be around 10 to 1 in favor of the attacker. So NATO sets up what it calls killing zones to deal with the onslaught.
This is Romeo 6-4, over. This is 6-4, okay. I think you're about to get flanked. Start pulling back slowly.
Its troops hope to even up the odds by firing from protected positions at the Soviet tanks as they come through in the open. But their losses are still likely to be very heavy, and there's no certainty that NATO will be able to stop the Soviets. The soldiers know very well, even from their experience on exercises, that they probably won't last long in battle.
Charlie 2, here Charlie, coming.
Grid 764, 398, artillery.
We started out in this village here. This is B combat team. We started off with 11 tanks, 8 armoured personnel carriers. That was 2 sections, 2 platoons of infantry. We've got guided weapon systems down the road there, and we had the umpires knocked us out 5 tanks, and both platoon commanders.
So you lost 5 out of 11 in a single day?
In the space of 30 minutes.
Is that normal?
It would be if they come at us. Yeah, that would be about right. If you get so many tanks coming towards us, I mean, we had about 3 combat teams come at us then. That's about 30 to 40 tanks that come at us. And that would be normal. Half our force would be knocked out. But we did stop. Normally, we were expected to last in a tank battle 2 hours. And that is our expected life expectancy in war. The tank crew is 2 hours.
I would say less than that. I would say you were talking about minutes. This, of course, can change varying on the circumstance and all this, which we hope we'll never find out. But generally, they say minutes, not hours.
I think my tank commander, whoever it was, who tells you he was only going to last 2 hours, that was being unduly gloomy.
They may disagree on the exact time, but everyone agrees it would happen very fast. And sooner or later, one side will start to lose. What would happen then? In one NATO war game, when Soviet tanks started breaking through, the NATO response was to use a single nuclear weapon as a sort of warning to go no further. But the soldiers playing the Soviet side felt they couldn't let themselves be blackmailed, so they answered with one of their own nuclear weapons. The escalation from there to all-out nuclear war took only a couple of days.
Nobody has fought, ever, in a nuclear environment, and so it's conjecture on both sides. We think that in our prepared positions and in our armored vehicles, which maintain a nuclear, biological and chemically free environment within them through filters, that we could do pretty well in a nuclear environment. But it's all conjecture from both sides.
Things would be much less healthy for people who are not inside tanks. And a major defeat in the land war is only one of the outcomes that could bring nuclear weapons into play. There are others. For example, what might happen if NATO just ran out of conventional weapons? What if there were no more planes for these pilots to fly? If tanks are the cart horses of a modern European war, these men ride the race horses, single combat fighters. They're the 20th century's answer to medieval knights going to war in $23 million worth of armor. Every day, some of them are on alert. Every day at some point, the alert flights are scrambled. And they can never be quite sure, 100% sure, that this time it's not for real. Their job in a real war would be crucial, attacking ground forces and striking at supply lines and stopping enemy aircraft from doing the same thing to their side. That much hasn't changed from World War II. But what they're flying has. High technology has taken over warfare, and fighter planes are out there on the leading edge. They're beautiful to look at, and the pilots love flying them. But there is a catch. Like all high technology goods, they're very delicate, which is likely to cause problems when you consider the environment they'd be operating in during wartime.
This is an F-15 Eagle, and it's a magnificent machine, probably the best fighter in the world. Its engines are so powerful that it can stand on its tail and accelerate straight up. Its missiles can reach out and destroy an enemy aircraft 20 miles away. The 20-millimeter cannon in its wing fires 100 rounds a second. But the heart of the plane is its electronics. It has a radar that can pick up enemy aircraft 50 miles away and tell you everything about them except what the enemy pilot had for breakfast. The data processing equipment is so complicated that one of the main computer's jobs is running the other computers. There's only about 100 of these aircraft in Europe, but each one is so effective that it can probably do the job of maybe 25 or 30 World War II fighters. The only possible drawback is that if you start losing these machines in combat, well, the current rate of production of F-15s in the United States is 7 per month.
It takes about 18 months to build an F-15. The $23 million cost is a measure of the materials and man-hours, especially the man-hours, that go into its construction. About the same amount of factory space is given over to the construction of military aircraft in the United States now as was devoted to the same purpose in Germany in World War II. But in 1944, Germany was building 3,000 planes a month and losing them at about the same rate. Current American production is about 40 per month. Bigger, better planes, but ones with their own problems.
It's a big airplane. We're used to driving big cars. It's a big, powerful airplane, and sometimes is being criticized for that because it's big and overpowered and very large, carries a tremendous amount of fuel, has a very big radar, has a very roomy cockpit, has a lot of range, but it also does a lot of things.
Hangar queens, they call them. Being able to do a lot of things means that these aircraft have a lot of equipment that can go wrong. For about 1/3 of their working life, these planes are out of order even in peacetime. Hardly a record that would inspire confidence even in your family car.
Okay, one more time. When you select guns, you say the gun reticle drops to the bottom right-hand corner of the HUD. Is that what's happening?
Yes, sir, that's all. Unless you go to caged on it, and then, of course, it comes up to where it's supposed to be by the waterline.
Go guns on the thing, and then go reticle stiffen and see what the reticle does.
Okay, stand by.
Where does it go when it gets a track test lock on? I mean, that would tell if it's going to work. Or...
Tonic, they're going to 3 Baghdad airplanes, so just go ahead and shut it down. get a hold of the line truck out there, tell them what the problem was with the HUD, see if they can get some avionics people on it. It's going to go to Turkey.
What's causing the problem here is the HUD, the head-up display.
Okay, sir. No problem. I'll write it up then. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm on the way back in.
Okay.
We have in the F-15 and most contemporary airplanes have what we call a head-up display. It's a very sophisticated gun sight, not unlike gun sights that have been in fighter airplanes for the last 20 or 30 years. It's a big piece of glass and you look through it all the time. But instead of just having a little pipper or dot that you put on the enemy when you're going to shoot a gun, it reads out everything that has to do with basic flight instruments, your height, altitude, and your speed, etc. And it puts up their symbology for weapons attack. Well, the first time somebody sees one of those things, they think it's very cluttered. I'm used to looking outside and have a lot of garbage up there that is going to bother me with my normal vision. Well, then after a little while they look at it again and they begin to not see the things they don't want, and they only see the things they do. Then pretty soon they can consciously look through it without seeing any of that information and see the targets that they always saw before. But now when they want to know some information about that target that they're looking at, they can just think for a minute and see the other number. Whereas before they had to look someplace else or take their focus off the adversary and go look in the cockpit for this information before. At first they were very reluctant to accept that, and justifiably. But after they got a little bit more exposure to it, they found out, hey, this is not too bad at all.
All this marvelous equipment and all the drawbacks it brings with it is not just an American or Western problem. The Russians have to plan for war in the same technological environment. So more and more they've been pushed in the same direction. They too now have aircraft that will do astounding things when they can get them out of the hangar and as long as they can guide them to their targets, which may not be for very long. If the two sides go to war, there's going to be an enormous traffic jam in the air over Central Europe. Put thousands of combat planes in the air at the same time, all shooting at each other, attacking ground targets, and being attacked by ground-based missiles. Add in the fact that the air bases and the control centers like this which keep track of the aircraft will be among the first targets to go in a war, and pretty soon nobody will know where anybody is.
Okay, I'll check. I'll check, thanks, on a leader.
Sir, did you scramble me around for 4-5? 4-5, did you scramble?
The TC is right there. All he's doing is he's going to pick some other body.
Yes.
0855. Go Big Ed. Broke bird 037 and 126 were going to land here. Now I'm told that 126 didn't land. 126 is pardon? 126 is still there. Now I'm told that he is back in Bovashane. Okay, well, when you get through the Bovashane, can you find out what's happening now? Because I thought they were going to swap out a tub.
A modern fighter aircraft on full power can cross West Germany in 8 minutes. Even in peacetime, it's a full-time job making sure the planes don't run into each other and that they all get home to the right base.
Your name, Overstreet?
We got the best airplane, and the airplane will do the job. We've got to make sure then that the pilots and the ground crews and everybody that supports that, the command and control system, can get us out there and get us to the target and keep us from getting shot down by our own airplanes or our own ground system. That's one of the very complicated things that has gotten a lot of attention. We're confident it can work, but it takes a lot of coordination.
The combat environment is becoming so complex and lethal that there's a real possibility of running out of your most important weapons quite quickly. This A-10, for example, is designed to destroy Russian tanks, which is a rather dangerous occupation. But the men who fly the planes habitually look on the bright side.
That's exactly right. And this airplane was designed to take hits and survive.
I mean, there is going to be an awful lot of flak over a battlefield these days.
There is. There's going to be a lot of AAA and a lot of SAMs.
AAA?
Anti-aircraft artillery.
But you reckon that you can, I mean, you're going low and slow over whole armored divisions and things, and you reckon with those things you got a decent chance of getting out?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Sure do. We're going to take losses, sure, but every airplane is. It's something you've got to live with, but there's enough redundancy in the airplane that even if we take a hit, the pilot can probably get out. And everybody's got total confidence. It's got one of the best ejection seats around.
Yeah, but the pilot gets out and the plane goes down, but I'm talking about running out of planes, really.
Well, I don't know. I'm not one of the big planners. I just fly them.
Yeah.
An American aircraft manufacturer recently remarked that the next time it will be a come-as-you-are war. The weapons that have already been built on the first day of the war will be the only ones you have. When they've been destroyed, that's it. The production lines for today's kinds of weapons couldn't possibly be expanded fast enough to replace even a fraction of the losses. All our expectations about a modern conventional war assume that aircraft like this, and tanks and guns and electronic equipment of a similar level of sophistication will be around in large numbers. It's a safe enough assumption for the first week of a European war, but by the third week there might not be many of these weapons left, and nobody knows what would happen then. One thing that is likely to happen is that chemical weapons will be used. You can't see them or smell them, but breathe a little or get a microscopic droplet on your skin, and you die. And you do not know you're dying until it's too late to do anything about it. The symptoms at first are quite innocent, but headaches are followed by convulsions, involuntary defecation, floods of mucus that almost drown you, and finally paralysis. Your chest muscles simply stop working and you suffocate.
There are many reasons why you get a more horrified reaction to the idea of constructing chemical weapons. I think in some senses it goes back to the Middle Ages and the feeling that chemicals are witchcraft. There's something you can't see, there's something that will kill people without you knowing what is happening. It's that sort of a magic that I think creates very much of the horror.
The Warsaw Pact and NATO both deny any intention of using chemical weapons, except if the other side uses them first. But the other side might just do that, so they both hold regular exercises where their soldiers scramble into the cumbersome gear that would give them at least some protection. And both sides keep huge stockpiles of nerve gas just in case.
Well, chemicals are considered by the Soviets to be almost a normal part of a conventional war. Not quite, but they are viewed as an intermediate sort of weapon. As a matter of fact, one of the Soviet doctrinal statements on this goes back to their quoting of a Harold Brown 1963 document where he referred to chemicals as an intermediate weapon between conventional and nuclear.
Hey, hold on. You got one there. You need two first? That's for you.
Wearing protective suits makes everything the troops do much harder.
You're right, there you go.
In fact, simply communicating while wearing this gear is so difficult that in chemical exercises, commanders have been known to throw stones at their men to get their attention.
It itches, huh?
Physically, it has its drawbacks. You are isolated, you're inside very restrictive clothing, you have a difficult time drinking, virtually impossible unless you can get out of the area to eat. There are other problems that will go with it that go without saying. It's just not a simple process. But then, what you're dealing with is the question of survival.
If the soldiers get their suits on and survive, the major job becomes decontamination. Vehicles that have been contaminated by droplets of gas are untouchable until they've been washed off, and nobody knows where the vast amounts of water would come from in a combat zone. One NATO plan talked of using West German civilian car washes, Presumably, tank commanders will be issued with 5-mark coins, at least those of them left alive.
Good job, man.
As for the suits, you can't take them off until they've been washed down thoroughly with more water, and then you take them off very carefully. It's all a hopelessly domestic response to what will be anything but a domestic situation.
The chemical casualties themselves, if they weren't treated immediately, would not reach us at all.
I see. Yeah. So that someone will have to have dealt with them before they,
yes.
They get to you.
We carry with our respirators, we carry oxine tablets, which are a prophylaxis against chemical attack, especially the nerve gas, and we carry atropine, which is an immediate treatment.
After you've been exposed?
After you've been exposed. But the trick is not to get exposed in the first place.
Rather difficult sometimes.
Rather difficult sometimes, yes.
But at least the soldiers have suits and oxine and atropine. The civilians living downwind from the battlefield don't, and clouds of nerve gas will drift silently and invisibly on the wind for up to 100 miles, bringing mass death to their towns and villages. The battlefield use of chemical weapons in Europe would inevitably mean civilian casualties in the millions. And we're still talking about what former U.S. Defense Secretary Harold Brown and the Russians have described as an intermediate weapon.
What about the real thing? What about nuclear weapons? Since we suspect that conventional war won't work, we also prepare for the nuclear war. First in the battlefield, soon after in our homes. That's the likely next step. NATO, for example, would almost certainly start using nuclear weapons if its conventional defenses collapse. And to keep the Russians worried, NATO has a doctrine called flexible response, which goes much further.
There is no such thing as a pre-planned escalation which necessarily must follow in steps each other, so to speak, first a conventional war and then a nuclear war. This would be very much against our philosophy of flexible response. Flexible response means that the enemy faces a completely uncalculable risk. It might even be that we use nuclear weapons from the outset. If the political decision is made for that, the military is prepared to do it.
The
side who are using nuclear weapons, what do they want? They want to destroy the enemy, to gain the advantage. But by doing that, they force the enemy to use nuclear weapons too. So the war will escalate to a level of general nuclear war. This is the dialectic of war and the structure of armed forces nowadays. In the last war, we didn't have nuclear weapons, so they weren't used. But now we have nuclear weapons, and no side will accept defeat before it uses all the weapons it has.
All the weapons it has. There are now 10,000 nuclear warheads in Europe, and if the dialectics of war mean anything, it probably won't be very long after the first shot until they come into use. And from battlefield nuclear weapons to city killers is a very short step.
The assumption that you can control a nuclear war is pure fantasy. From the moment the first nuclear weapons released on a European battlefield, you open Pandora's box, and you don't know what's coming out. But one thing you can count on is that there will be a very high probability of early and steep escalation into the strategic warlike exchange that nobody wants. So you mustn't use the things.
Even before the escalation starts, the soldiers will find the nuclear battlefield an uninhabitable place. the old game will be over.
If they started using nuclear weapons, what kind of casualties?
The mind boggles at the thought. I mean, we know what difficulties we had over the last 2 days with the sort of throughput we had, which was only up to about 50 an hour. But when you're talking about thousands and thousands of casualties, one could only, I think, treat those which were simply treated, immediately treated, and with a very high chance of survival, which would be very much the minority.
The rest just
would, if they didn't perish straight away, would perish very shortly afterwards. Because the treatment for radiation, high doses of radiation, well, there is no treatment. If you start using them, we lose. We all lose.
Yes, I know we do, yeah.
Yeah.
For 30 years now, the people of this village have watched the tanks roll up towards the border each autumn and come back again a couple of weeks later. These exercises have become a kind of ritualized activity, and every year the ritual gets a little bit more expensive and a little bit more bizarre. We've turned Central Europe into a kind of game park where we're trying to preserve an endangered species, conventional war, because we're desperately trying to stave off the alternative, a return to total war. Nuclear total war. These soldiers aren't fools. They know perfectly well that the efficient, modern, cost-effective way to stop tanks isn't to set up an elaborate killing zone. You simply drop a nuclear bomb on them. Better yet, you drop nuclear weapons on the cities where the people who built the tanks live. That's total war in the 20th century tradition. But if we fight another total war like that, it's not just those soldiers who die. You and I die too, and pretty well everybody we ever met.
If these soldiers ever have to go into battle, we'll order them to fight a conventional war for as long as possible. The problem is that this distinction we've created between conventional and nuclear war is in the end an artificial distinction, and probably a pretty flimsy one. If either side started to win a conventional war, the other would bring out its nuclear weapons. But a stalemate would also bring strong pressures to escalate.
So, win, lose, or draw, conventional war in Europe leads back towards nuclear war, probably in a matter of only a couple of weeks. And once the first battlefield nuclear weapon has been fired in Europe, we've passed the last clearly defined barrier to nuclear war, and we're heading straight for the Holocaust.